Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of our podcast, Cannabis Unlocked. I'm Pete Karabas with Key Investment Partners. And today on the show, we have VP of Insights and Analytics at BDS Analytics, Kelly Nielsen. Kelly, we're super pleased to have you on the show.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thanks, Pete.
Awesome. So today, Kelly and I were talking the other day, and BDSA has just released their global markets forecasts. That covers 38 separate countries, states, provinces, covers products by category, broken down into adult use, medical use, illicit market, et cetera. So it's really a comprehensive report that covers all of cannabis. So Kelly, it would be great if you could, just for our listeners' benefit, tell us a little bit about yourself, BDS Analytics, how you guys come up with the forecasts, some of the methodology behind it. That would all be super helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. So just by means of background, as Pete mentioned, I lead overall insights and analytics here in BDSA. Thrilled to be here. I've been with the organization a little bit over a year and have definitely been diving headfirst in the cannabis industry. Prior to that, I spent the first 15 plus years or 14 plus years of my career at the Nielsen company. So have spent a lot of time in market research, a lot of time in new product and market forecasting, and excited to bring that to this space. So When we think about who is BDSA and what do we do, our overall objective is to provide a total look at the cannabinoid industry. And what that really means is we have a range of different tools and solutions to address a really wide range of questions of what's happening today, why is that happening today, and what do we expect to happen in the future? So just for some perspective, for example, when I talk about what's going on in the market today, one of our core solutions is retail sales tracking. We partner with dispensaries to understand what products, brands, SKUs are moving through dispensaries in 11 different markets in the United States and several provinces in Canada to really understand what's moving today, how are the categories being impacted, at what price points, et cetera. We also conduct a range of consumer work to understand why is this happening? How are consumer perceptions and attitudes and behaviors changing toward the cannabis industry? Really exciting because we're actually going to our 9th wave of research there. So we have this trended data, which, as you can imagine, over the past 4 to 5 years, consumer perceptions have changed a lot. So really exciting to see some of those evolutions. And then finally, as we think about market forecasts, right? Like this is all about what's going to happen into the future. And so our market forecasts go 5 years into the future. So we're talking now, our forecast go out to 2026. And as you mentioned, we're really taking a look at this at a global level. And so we're merging a lot of different data sources in order to come up with this. We're really building it from the bottom up. And so what that means is that, the first thing that we're doing is we're gathering a ton of information around what we know about the sales in any given market. In the United States and Canada, that means using our retail sales tracking information in order to layer that in of what historically has happened in order to model what we think is going to happen in the future. We're gathering tax information, any publicly available information, but we're layering that with a lot of demographic information, consumer spending information, patient counts, any information that we can get our hands on in order to build the most robust models available for this particular space. And like you mentioned, what's really exciting is that, in the United States and Canada, we do break down our forecasts at the state and province level. So we can provide perspective on what we think is going to happen at that level of granularity, as well as by category. And this is really important because another factor that really feeds into our forecast is regulatory timing, because that really is a key assumption as we go into this, right? What does it look like when our state's going to come online, particularly in the United States?
Certainly the golden question there that everyone wants to know. And so Kelly, I know when we were talking earlier, it's not surprising to people in the cannabis space that this is the case, but if I understand correct, BDS has increased their forecasts, global forecast, with this most recent report.
Yeah, we have. So just for some perspective, we expect the overall 2021 global legal market forecast to reach about $30.6 billion,
Okay.
which is roughly about a 9 or 10% increase versus our prior estimates. And that's driven by a couple things, but it's not to give away what I'm going to be talking about here in a little bit, but we're seeing just the speed at which states are coming online and markets are coming online continues to accelerate. So we've taken up our overall 2021 projections, but then as we think about into the future, we expect the global cannabis market to reach $62.1 billion by 2026. So that's a pretty big number we're talking about these days.
Okay, gotcha. And what was the former number from last year that we had? Today it's 62 and change.
Yep. Yeah. So previously it was 55.4. So taking it up about $5 billion, $7 billion.
Okay. Okay. And so are you seeing, then what are you seeing exactly? Is it that states, of course, are legalizing quicker? I think we see that more and more. I think that's even going to grow exponentially. That's not surprising. Are you also seeing, what are you seeing in the current markets versus the new markets, emerging markets? How are some of these states, especially the newer ones, are they using the mature states as blueprints? What do you see there?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, the first thing to call out as we're thinking about what's driving this growth is really, as you alluded to, it's driven by the United States adult use markets. So just for perspective, if we hone in on the United States specifically, we expect that the United States market is going to reach about $24.9 billion in 2021 and expand to about $47.6 billion by 2026. So if you think about that as, 47.6 is a percentage of that $62 billion, the United States market is going to make up a majority of that overall volume.
Wow.
And when we think about that United States specifically, I'd say, first of all, that growth is going to be coming from the adult use market. So we expect the legal medical market to top out around $12 billion in 2023, and then expect that to decline after that. And so the implication there is the adult use market is really what's going to carry the growth in the United States, reaching about $36.3 billion by 2026. And
so,
as you, sorry.
I was just going to say, Kelly, when you say or talk about the medical market topping out, obviously a lot of people believe that cannabis has huge medicinal uses. I think personally that a lot of those will need more time to develop, even if it goes more into a pharmaceutical direction. But today, when you guys are estimating the total size of the market, is it the case that really medical is just a stepping stone to adult use, and once rec comes online in a state, the medical sales end up probably just flat or down?
Yeah, I think so when we see medical states come online, we definitely see available for adult use. We do see the medical market begin to decline. Now that said, the contribution to volume from the medical market continues to evolve. So in states that did not have a well-established medical market prior to legalization, so for example, Illinois, Michigan, what we're likely going to see with New York and New Jersey, those medical markets are relatively small given the size of the populations, versus something like Arizona, where that was $1 billion medical market prior to moving toward adult use legalization. And so I think the implication there is if we look at the contribution to volume from the medical market in states like Illinois, Colorado, Michigan, et cetera, medical market relatively small, 20% or less of overall volume in the marketplace. Meanwhile, if you look at Arizona, we actually see that while the medical market continues to decline in terms of the overall contribution to volume month over month, it makes up at least about half, if not about 60% of the overall volume. So I think the implication there, it continues to decline when adult use comes into fruition, but if you have a large medical market coming into adult use legalization, it might hold on a little bit longer.
I see. That's super interesting. So people, I imagine in some sense, are already used to it, the medical market. They might already have medical cards, so they continue to do what they've done in the past. Whereas in a state like New York, it's going to be this overnight recreational situation.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
And how about, I get this question all the time, and you can probably answer it much better than I can. What do you see in terms of the illicit markets, illicit state markets? Once cannabis comes on, like what's typical for any given state today that has legal recreational cannabis? And I'm sure you categorize those in different ways, but what does the illicit market look like, maybe as a percentage of sales or whatever metric you think is most relevant?
Yeah, so it really does depend on the market, because some markets have a long-standing established history of just an illicit market overall. And so, for example, if
Hmm.
you think about California, Michigan, prior to any degree of legalization, they had pretty substantial illicit markets. And same thing with New York. I don't know if I should say this on a podcast, but my friends in New York, they can get a menu
Sure.
of cannabis products already, for someone to deliver to their door. And so it's a pretty well-established machine in some of these states. And so those states that have that sort of illicit infrastructure are going to be harder to combat from an overall contribution to volume standpoint. So, for example, today, California actually, as it's the biggest market in the entire country
Hmm.
from a legal sales perspective, but it has just as much, if not more, volume moving through the illicit market today. And so, over time, we expect that to decline. But California is probably an extreme example where we continue to see a lot of volume moving through an illicit channel. Whereas if we think about, a state like Illinois, which didn't have that kind of like well-standing infrastructure prior to adult
Hmm.
use legalization, it makes up a smaller contributor to overall volume, where legal sales outpacing illicit sales.
Right, right, right. And I have to imagine that's somewhat, I guess, people's choice whether to continue to use an illicit market or to, adopt the new legal market. I imagine that's somewhat of a function of price, and probably just as much habit in some instances if they're a regular user. But is that kind of what you see?
Yeah, we definitely see that, when folks might be up, well, I think there's probably two dynamics. I think, the first really is habit. And I think what is really interesting though is, so if we take a look at some of these newly legal states, so just for perspective, when we conduct our consumer insight surveys, we typically see these days that about 43% of adults in adult use markets are cannabis consumers within the past 6 months. What's really interesting about that, though, is that about half of past 6 month consumers are saying they are new to the cannabis industry within 1 year. Any
Wow.
cannabis, legal or
Okay.
illicit. And so I think the implication there is exactly as you mentioned, the first dynamic of if someone is purchasing illicit or legal is going to be, what is the habit? And so we probably see those folks that have more history with cannabis usage still tapping into some of their original contacts or within the illicit market. But these new consumers are likely opting in and moving right into the legal market because it's more readily
Sure.
available. And quite frankly, they probably feel more comfortable with it. And
Yeah,
then, as you mentioned,
absolutely.
pricing. So I think pricing does have a play there, especially with those folks where it's, longer standing history with the cannabis market in general.
I bet. I bet. And no, that's not surprising at all. I think that also there's so many people I think in the new markets that simply will not buy cannabis products in the illicit market
Yep.
for good reason. And now that the industry's lost its stigma a bit, you have all these new form factors. I think that's a huge a difference when you have regulation in a market. Is
Yeah.
some people just don't want to smoke. They don't like to smoke. They don't want to inhale anything, but they'll eat an edible. And so I
Really.
think that's a huge difference. And the kind of form factors, gosh, that you see today.
Mhm.
It's not even close to what you would see in the illicit market. Of course, it's
A
too many choices,
lot
to
of
say the
product and
least,
vape these
as you
days.
guys know
Yep.
very well. Yeah.
Yep,
Um,
absolutely.
okay, cool. And so we talked a little bit about medical and recreational, mature, emerging in new markets. And then one thing I wanted to touch on that I think we lost there was um, when you think about the regulatory environment and how that's changing. Obviously, a lot of people are looking at safe banking and what Schumer said in the past 3 months or so. How do you guys estimate, which states are coming online when? I know BDS has always been very conservative in their forecasting. But it's a hard thing to estimate. How do you guys do that? And then how have you seen it change? Right, 2 years ago there was a certain outlook and a pace of things, how quickly we were going to reach federal legalization. Now it almost feels like it's just going to go on this state by state path for maybe a while. You know, you kind of hear projections all over the map. But what's the BDSA stance there?
Yeah, so the BDSA stance at the highest level is that we do expect some degree of opening of, I'm going to use quotations, federal legalization within the next year or so. But at the highest level, we really expect that that means, you know, open banking and hopefully some degree of decriminalization. That from an execution standpoint, we expect that states are going to continue to reserve the right to regulate cannabis within their borders. And so the implication there is that we're going to just see states one by one coming online with either medical or adult use, depending on their situation. And so I think that there's a couple things that that really come into play there. And so, you know, we talked a little bit about this idea of like, you know, the mature markets continue to grow. And I want to just like reiterate that because, for example, we saw that, you know, the most mature markets, if you think California, Nevada, Oregon, they grew double digits the first half of this year. But when we talk about speed, I think what's really interesting, and this is where regulatory framework really comes into play, is when we think first about emerging markets. And so when I talk about emerging markets, this is going to be states that are relatively newly legal. And so I think about this as like Illinois, Massachusetts, Michigan from the adult use standpoint. And then actually Florida and Pennsylvania and Oklahoma from a medical only standpoint. And I bring up regulatory framework because within those adult use legal states, we've seen that they've been able to move a lot faster in getting products to consumers than what we saw in the past. So each Illinois, Massachusetts, and Illinois are going to be pushing $1.8 billion of revenue of consumer takeaway this year. And so that's, you know, very substantial growth. Each of them topped out close to $1 billion last year. If they didn't reach it, they absolutely will surpass it this year, probably expected to grow by about 80%. And so, you know, I think that that's the first thing, is that these adult use markets are getting product to consumers earlier. They're opening doors for adult use faster, and it's enabling faster growth of these emerging states. But then on the other hand, you have these large population states with relatively lax regulation on the medical side of things, meaning, you know, relatively easy-ish to get licenses, but more important that patients are, medical cards are very accessible. And so if you look at a state like Florida or Pennsylvania, Oklahoma, these are, you know, $1 billion plus medical markets. I think we're expecting Florida to reach close to $1.6, $1.7 billion this year. And so that's how that's evolving those states. But then it's like you take it a step farther, and what does that mean for these new states that are coming online? And so on one hand, if we look at states like New York, New Jersey, all of these high population states, we expect that the model with which they're going to bring product to consumers is probably more similar to like what we've seen in Illinois, Massachusetts, Michigan, where they're not going to spend 3 to 5 years trying to figure out their supply chain. They're going to have it figured out at least in more capacity than, you know, say Colorado or Oregon when they legalized. And so we're going to see more rapid growth than we saw in some of those states. And then I think on the flip side of that, you know, we have these big medical markets. That Arizona was really interesting because it was the fastest market to move from medical to adult use. And they were able to do that in just 2 months because of the pre-existing size of their medical market. Again, $1 billion market before they became adult use legal. And so if we think into the future, if we think about states like Pennsylvania, Florida, Oklahoma, we still expect adult uses a couple of years out. But when those states do legalize, we expect that they'd be able to transition quickly and make product more available to folks without a med card.
Right. No, it's a super interesting point. One we look at all the time too is, you know, you'd think over time, and, you know, we've been in cannabis now for a little over 3 years. You'd think over time that everyone kind of converges into one process that seems like it works. I've found that it's actually goes off in the opposite directions. I mean, everyone almost wants to come up with their own precedent of how it should be regulated, and you have some wacky license structures, and one medically legal state does not even compare to another one, which in one sense is almost acting. It's so loose. It's almost like a recreational state. So it's crazy how that works. But so what you're finding then is the ones with the medical infrastructure and robust medical market can obviously flip on the rec switch pretty quick when they want to.
Yeah, I mean, assuming that the medical stores are the first ones that would be able to get the licenses. That's kind of the
Right.
caveat there. That's what happened in Arizona. The first licenses for both cultivation and sales were given to those who already had medical licenses. But I think, quite frankly, that's probably a smart way to do it because there's already an infrastructure and supply chain in place. You don't really have to reinvent
Right.
the wheel when you take that sort of approach.
Right. No, that's super interesting. All right. Well, this has been great, Kelly. One last thing I'd love to hear in your opinion. What does the cannabis market look like in 2026? You've obviously done a lot of work thinking about it all the way down to the category and product level. What type of world do we live in 2026? Is the majority of the U.S. recreational? It's of course got to be all medical, but is interstate commerce working? And
Yeah.
what's your 2 cents there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that as we look into 2026, I think the first thing to call out is the availability of adult use product is going to be very substantial. So well over half of the population is going to have access to adult use. Just one thing to call out, our holdout, from our forecast assumption is Texas. That as of right now, Texas is a very interesting state. We do not assume that adult use will be available in Texas the next couple of years, but Texas, I know, has been known to surprise us. So I think that's just one call out when we think about the availability of population, that
Right.
Texas is our holdout state at the moment, but we're obviously keeping a very close pulse on it. I think the other thing is the continued destigmatization of cannabis.
Totally.
When we take a look at our most mature markets, the penetration of consumers is reaching 50%. And so if you compare that to something like, alcohol, where we typically see adult use penetration around 60 to 65%, not to continue to grow as
Right.
we bring more states online and as people get more comfortable with understanding how cannabis and cannabinoids fit into their lifestyles.
No, I think that's exactly right. I think the destigmatization thing's actually a big thing that almost isn't talked about enough. I mean, just the way people think about it, talk about it openly, is wildly different than even 2 years ago. So in my opinion, that's a huge progress because that's ultimately what moves the dial in terms of what people want and what each state wants. And the tax revenue doesn't hurt either if you're a governor.
Tax revenue does not hurt at all. I think in Chicago, what was it? The cannabis tax exceeded alcohol tax in the first half of this year in Q1 or Q2 or something. So, what was the governor of Pennsylvania said at some point, you can't afford to not legalize cannabis. So
that's exactly right. That's exactly right. I think that's a great note to wrap it up here. Kelly, I appreciate you coming on the Cannabis Unlocked podcast. It's been a pleasure having you. As always, incredible amount of detailed analytics, new information for us to talk about. You guys can find more information, detailed information that Kelly and her team at BDS is working on. Go to bdsanalytics.com. For that, check out the retail sales product as well. It's quite amazing. But with that, I'll wrap it up. Thanks so much, Kelly. Appreciate you coming on.
yeah, thanks so much, Pete. Great to be here.